IAW began at the University of Toronto in 2005, and since then has expanded exponentially to university campuses and cities and community spaces across the globe. Last year, reaching a benchmark 215 cities worldwide. We've been organizing IAW here in Beirut for the past 4 years, and we've also started organizing it in the north, in Tripoli, and in the south. Basically, the idea behind IAW is to raise awareness about Israel as an apartheid state, and also to kind of create spaces where we can discuss and promote activism for the Palestinian struggle. Tonight, I'd like to first of all thank Issam, the Center for American Studies and Research, as well as the Islamic Resistance for their support in making this event happen. We are very honored to have with us today Dr. Seif Dana, who is a professor at the Department of Sociology at the University of Wisconsin, as well as a very innovative and prolific researcher and frequent contributor to Islamic Praxis. He's going to be talking tonight about a very innovative topic of the curve of American power, Israel, and the Arab Uprisings. We'll have a lecture and then plenty of time for question and answer, and hopefully a live discussion. So thank you very much, and welcome, Seif.
Okay, good evening. Masal khair. Thank you for the Palestinian Cultural Club, PYM, Issam Faris Institute, and the Center for American Studies for hosting me. What I want to do tonight actually is present some sort of 3 surveys, really, basically, and trying to present the Israeli view of the Arab Uprising, or the transformation of the Israeli view of the Arab Uprisings from the very beginning until the second year, in light of or within the context of the curve of American power, or the decline of American hegemony in the world. And the reason for doing this is basically, I think it's a way to kind of conceptualize or reconceptualize the American-Israeli relations, given the debate between the lobby doctrine on one side, or the lobby theory on one side, and the other views that looks at the Israeli American relations from the point of view of systemic relations, cultural, economic, political, ideological, etc. So this is what I'm basically doing. The first survey would look basically, or a summary, a sample of a survey that would look at the American decline. I'll try to support that because I actually believe in the argument that the American empire is in a state of decline, and has been in a state of decline since at least 1967, when the world capitalist system entered the second phase of what is called by the world system theory conductive cycle, or the downward phase of the economic cycle. And to show what some journalists say about this, a survey of journalism, or what we could characterize as economic journalism. The second one focuses on scholarship, what some scholars, specifically world system theory scholars, say about the American decline or the decline of American hegemony, and to look at some aspects of this decline, political, economic, and ideological or cultural decline. The third is, in light of this, look at the Israeli response to the Arab uprisings. And the Israeli response to the Arab uprising actually was dynamic and changed over the last 2 years. And one of the most significant things, I wasn't really interested in what Israelis think or what Israel think about the Arab uprisings, as much as what does this response or reaction to the Arab uprising signify? And in this case, it signifies an important role, actually an existential role, for both the American hegemony, global American hegemony or international hegemony, and the second, the American presence in the Middle East. So this is basically what I'm doing. And Just to clarify the title, the part on the pitiful, helpless giant is actually taken from a speech by President Nixon at the end of the Vietnam War. But that was actually happening in 1970, and it signified, in his speech, he basically was admitting or signifying a decline, a political decline in the American hegemony. Basically, the Vietnam defeat restructured or structured basically the geopolitics of the world in the post-1970 world. These are the two frameworks that we could use, or that I could use basically. The first one, which I will actually be focusing on more, is the 1945 to the present, and look at the contractive cycle of the economic, of the world system, or the capitalist world system. And basically, this says that in the world system, the contractive cycle basically is 2 phases. Sometimes some scholars deal with it in terms of 4 phases, like a year, spring, summer, autumn, and winter. But we can reduce them basically to two phases. Phase 1 basically is an upward swing usually, and phase B or phase two is a downward swing. In the first one, there will usually is an economic expansion, and the second one, an economic contraction. That's the context, the economic context within which I want to situate the American decline, or the decline of the American hegemony. There is a larger, actually, framework that we can use to see the decline of the American power or American hegemony, and that's the life cycle of the capitalist world system itself, beginning in 1450, at least according to the economic history provided by the world system theory, people like Immanuel Wallerstein or Samir Amin and others. And this basically says that the genesis of the world system began, Samir Amin would say somewhere around 1000, the year 1000. Wallerstein would say something around 1450. And the second phase, that's the genesis phase, or the preparation phase. In the second phase, which is the normal development period, which lasted after that, the first period he calls the long 16th century, from 1450 to about 1640. The last one, which both Amin and Wallerstein and others actually agree that there is some sort of consensus, at least in that field, in that theoretical orientation, that we are in the terminal crisis period. Terminal crisis period, that there is a structural, serious structural crisis that is facing the capitalist world system, and that the crisis is leading to somewhere we don't really know yet where it's going, but we are in a terminal crisis, structural crisis, or in a stage of terminal crisis. So when we talk about basically decline, when we talk about a period of transition which the world is living at this point, we actually mean both things: the transformation within the world capitalist system on one hand, but most significantly for immediate and practical politics. The first one is more significant and more important. And it's divided basically into 2 stages. The first stage from 1945, immediately after the Second World War, to 1967, or some people take it to 1973. And that's the period of the uncontested American hegemony. And when we say American hegemony, we mean basically economic hegemony, or you can characterize it as economic imperialism, political imperialism, ecological imperialism, ideological imperialism, cultural imperialism, and also epistemological imperialism. That the American hegemony, the United States of America as an empire, dominated the world through these tools. The economy, it was uncontested. The productivity of the United States was unmatched, basically, and it was able to undersell any country or any society in their own market. Ideologically, the U.S., of course, New York became basically, or culturally, New York became the center of the world's cultural production. Ideologically, of course, the Western's lifestyle, the capitalist ideas, the market economy became also uncontested. Epistemologically as well, the epistemological orientation of the American empire and the way they do social science, they do research, actually dominated also the knowledge field. In some sense, now we can see the rise of what we can call native epistemology, which is contesting the epistemological imperialist orientation. That's what I'm focusing on. So I'm going to focus on the first stage. This is some of you might have read this. It was published in Al-Akhbar. Originally, it wasn't really published in Al-Akhbar in English, but this is the original journal for Noam Chomsky is talking about this. But he's basically saying that the idea of an American decline has become, excuse me, a common theme. So it's not a breakthrough. Nobody is a genius at this point saying that the American empire is in a state of decline, or we're seeing the setting of the American empire. He says that in the American Academy of Political Science, the journal of the American Academy of Political Science, they mention this, that it's a common theme. The American decline is a common theme. This is the website for this volume. I think it's summer 2011. That's basically in the political science area that this is has becoming. Before that, actually, it was a common kind of theme. This is part of the survey that I mentioned. Wallerstein says in one of his recent articles that this is not really news. The question now really is, what is not yet sufficiently appreciated is the precise nature of this decline and when it did begin. In some sense, that's where people might debate. But the idea itself is not really debatable. The American empire is in a state of decline. This is the first survey. What I did is basically look at what we might characterize, as I said, economic journalism. This is the latest issue, just came out before I came of Foreign Affairs. And Foreign Affairs is published by Council on Foreign Relations, basically the establishment, the American political establishment. And if you just Google the board members of the Council on Foreign Relations, you'll see former secretaries in there, members, congressmen, senators, congresswomen as well. So basically, this is the voice of the establishment. And the fact that they're trying to contest the idea, we're entering this kind of debate. This is the latest one, January, February, because it's issued once every 2 months. And basically, this is what we will see: the fall and rise of the West. They're trying to argue that we face difficulties, but we're rising again. Can America be fixed? Actually, this is a question. Europe after the crisis, why the euro will survive. This is from one issue of Foreign Affairs, again, just last month. I selected certain articles, a sample of from the same. Paul Krugman took in one of the debates, a series of debates on this same issue, began in Foreign Affairs around 1985. But one of the interesting ones that I found is this one, in which he basically argues an idea that we will see. And Samir Amin basically criticized people, what he called economic journalism, something like we see in Foreign Affairs. And he was the one who actually called them economic journalism. And he said that he dismissed all their arguments on the grounds that it's based on an imaginary view of capitalism. We will see what Samir Amin says in a minute. But basically, they constructed a different kind of capitalism, and they make their arguments based on this. So, but this article basically distinguishes between cycles and trends. We're not really interested in cycles if we're talking about a decline in hegemony as much as we're interested in trends. Cycles, every cycle will go through a period or a phase of growth and a phase of decline. But in the case of trends, this is where it's going. What we're seeing is basically it's falling. So any optimism regarding the possibility or the potential for the American empire to actually reclaim its status will be basically fruitless. This is another one, a second debate. It's talking or questioning the idea of a potential second American century. And these are the latest, some of the latest articles on the same topic. Now, the fact that it's actually in the open and people are actually debating this in journalism and scholarship, then we're actually dealing with something serious here, that it's not just an idea. As far back as 2003, you would seem really crazy if you made this argument. And Immanuel Wallerstein actually made this argument in 2003, and his book was very much dismissed at that time. So these three articles, Financial Times, New York Times, and this is, I think, Monthly Review, Immanuel Wallerstein. Basically, the titles are very telling. America's Inevitable Retreat from the Middle East. It's, of course, connected to the American global decline or international decline, decline in hegemony. Second one, An American Recovery. That's a question, don't believe the hype. And Wallerstein basically is very straightforward. The economic recovery, that's not really happening. Steve Walt from Foreign Policy, and he's also a professor at Harvard, he basically says it's not really a question of whether the US hegemony is declining or not, but it's a question of how the US will adapt to this. Will the US basically adapt to this, to the new status? And he assumes that basically the barrier is basically psychological, that the Americans and America itself has to come to the fact, to accept the fact that it is declining and adjust its strategies accordingly. The Brookings Institute also published, actually it was the first one that began this argument. In 1985, it published a series of papers, basically, that was questioning the idea, and this work excuse me, was dismissed in 1985 as basically fighting the last war, they said. But what they point out clearly is that they're talking about a trend. They're not talking about a cycle. That it is always possible to come back to talk about economic recovery, to talk about decline in unemployment rate, to talk about increase in growth rates. But at the end, there is what they call the fundamentals of the economy, and the fundamentals of the economy, that there is a trend towards decline, long-term decline in economic growth. That's the first one. Long-term structural unemployment. And these cannot be really fixed by one cycle, and therefore there is one trend. That was really the beginning. This is this is some of the most a sample actually of some of the most recent work by Immanuel Wallerstein, was one of the most important authorities on the world capitalist system. And the first three are books, and the rest are just selection of his articles or his latest papers, actually. Just look at the title, Alternative, the United States Confronts the World, The Decline of American Power, The World We Are Entering. They're all talking about a new world, an age of transition, and a decline of American hegemony. All his articles, The Curve of American Power, from which I took actually part of the title for this article, for this talk. You can see all of them. My favorite is The Eagle Has Crash Landed. This is the argument that Samir Amin makes in the January issue of Monthly Review. And he basically says that those who are arguing against the idea of decline in American hegemony are basing their analysis and arguments on an imaginary view of capitalism. To be a realist and to be historical in your view of capitalism, he says that it's not a system based on trans-historical rationality. There is no such a thing, of course. Basically, that would allow it to reproduce itself indefinitely. But it's a historical system. It has a beginning, a genesis, a rise, and an end, or a decline. These are the three stages that he talks about. He begins in the year 1000, actually. Wallerstein begins with what he calls the long 16th century in 1450. But they all both here were the long decline. This is an interesting book. I guess that that's a good account of the economic history of the world capitalist system, the awakening of the South by Samir Amin. And the only differences here are differences regarding the date. Is it the year 1000 or is it the year 1450? Do we call it the long 16th century or we don't call it the long 16th century? But basically, the fundamentals are the same and the premises are the same. We're dealing with a historical system that is entering a structural crisis phase, or a phase of structural crisis. So we're not questioning here, or they're not questioning really the American empire or the decline of the American empire. They're questioning the sustainability of the whole capitalist system. Nobody's arguing, of course, for something specific as an alternative. It's a product of structural processes, and where the crisis is leading the world, we don't know, or they don't know, but basically, this is where we are. This is the same thing. I basically outlined this, but I want to focus on one aspect of the decline, and that's the economic decline. And the economic decline is usually measured by either basically the GDP share of the country in the world production, or the country's contribution, the economic contribution to the contribution to the global production. And what we see is not only a decline, but at some point it becomes an accelerating decline in the American contribution to the global production, which makes the US, or which made the US in the first place, a hegemonic power in the first place. Around the 1950, the US GDP share was about 50%. That is, half of the world production was American, basically. In the 1960s, this data, I compiled this table, but the data is available at the World Bank website. You have to work to get it, but it's there. In 1960, the US contribution to the world production was about 38%. In 2011, it's 18%. So it's in a state of decline. I just want to point out that when we talk about decline, we talk about a structural process. We talk about a relative process. So the US was actually increasingly producing more and more than ever before. But relatively, that contribution was declining because of the existence of other forces. But it's also structural in the sense that it is irreversible. What gave the US the edge after the Second World War is being captured by other societies or by other countries. So the US doesn't really have this edge that would enable the US to claim the status of the hegemonic power in the world system. This is just a representation of the decline of the American contribution to the world production from 1960 to 2011 up to number. This is more clear probably because it's a decade old. Well, 1960, 70, 80, 2000, I skipped 90, I couldn't find it, 2000 and 2011. So what we basically see is a trend, a decline in the GDP contribution to the world production. This shows the picture probably more clearly. This is the US GDP, and this is the world production. Both are increasing at different rates, not, of course, in favor of the US. So we moved from around between 1945 and 1950, when the US was producing almost half of the world production, to now, when the US is producing only about 18% of the world production. When I say relative because other countries are, of course, entering the stage, and by implication, the US is losing the edge. This is China in 2003, the contribution versus the US versus the world production. And this is China in 2011 versus the US versus the world. So that's what I meant. It's relative. Then we have a trend. And I'm going to talk about the political significance, of course, of that at the end. And that's the whole point, really, of this. But to confirm this more, actually, more evidence on this, this was published by the American National Intelligence, just a report, a 5-year report that is usually published by the American National Intelligence every 5 years. That's what makes it every 5 years, right? The latest one was published in December of 2012, about 3 months ago, or even 2 months ago, actually. And it's talking about the global trends, an alternative world. What would the world look in 2030, basically? And they basically make the same argument that in 2030, the US will not be the hegemonic power. It's not going to be a third world country, and we're not selling illusions, basically, that the US will be just another country. It will remain a very powerful country by all standards, but it's not going to be the hegemonic power in the sense we knew since 1945 anymore. This is the average increase in percentage point share of global GDP per decade. The study says basically that it took Britain about 155 years to double the GDP per capita with only 9 million people in 1870. It took the US and Germany between 30 and 60 years to do the same thing. India and China, with 100 times more people, are doing that at a rate that is unseen before. This is, again, from the report.
Can you repeat the source again?
It's called Global Trends, the American National Security Report. I think I have it here. This one. Alternative worlds. Again, this is just a comparison between the United States contribution to the world production versus the China. You can see the increase, and you can see the slow increase in growth in the case of the United States. Basically, China grew from under $2 trillion in 2003 to almost $8 trillion in 2011. The US, a little bit under 12 trillion to 15 trillion. The proportion of the increase is, of course, significantly different. But the most important is this one, the US versus the world. The world GDP increased from about 35 trillion to 70, almost doubled between 2003 and 2011. In the case of the United States, it's from 11 trillion to 15. So it's significantly much less. Okay, so it began then in 1945 to 1967 or 1973. That's the phase of the American hegemony, uncontested hegemony. And around the 1970, at the end of the Vietnam War, that was just the political side of the issue. The American empire entered the second phase of the contractive cycle, in which there was an economic contraction, and they were aware of it. From President Nixon until President Clinton, 1970 to almost 2000, they were seriously aware of this, and their role was, or their strategy was, because they understood it, I think, very well, their strategy was to slow the decline. They can't work against history, basically, but they can slow it down, slow the decline down. And the strategy they followed was basically called soft multilateralism. And it's soft because they used it when it's necessary. So it was really unilateral strategy in some sense, but they were forced at a certain point to work with or to talk about partnership with allies, especially in Europe and in Japan. But at some point when they lost their edge there, also they lost some of the influence. Nuclear monopoly, and that's, I guess, one of the cases that explains the Iranian case at this point. But had it been happening before the 2000, it would have been, they would have pursued it differently. Now, fortunately for the Iranians and for the rest of the world, the US is in a different place. But probably each one of them, the first one offering partnership to allies whenever it's necessary, and focusing on nuclear monopoly, were successful in part. They weren't fully successful. That's why we had, at some point, England signing agreements and treaties with the Soviet Union at that time, during the Thatcher period. The nuclear monopoly, they weren't also successful. They managed to prevent many countries from acquiring nuclear power, but also they failed in the case of Pakistan, in the case of India, and of course, in other cases probably. And the case of Israel, of course, is kind of unique. But probably the third strategy was the most successful, neoliberalism. And neoliberalism was the most significant and most important tool, probably, that extended the American hegemony in some sense, but also the most significant tool, and the US was very successful in this. Basically, I'm using persuading here the governments of the South. In some cases, it wasn't really a matter of persuasion here as much as using sometimes threats and force. But basically, that the models that were presented to the countries of the South are export-oriented globalization. But this is the strategy that was most successful in the case of slowing the American decline. And that's what I think when people fight neoliberalism around the world at this point, and we see that all over the world, but basically they're fighting one of the most powerful tools of imperialism around the world. But again, none of these were entirely successful. They were successful in part, but the most successful was neoliberalism. In 2001, after the September 11 events, Bush decided to pursue a new strategy, which is really the old strategy, but disregarding partners for all the time instead of some of the time. And that was the unilateral policy. And of course, all the indicators show that the new policy not only did not slow the decline, but actually accelerated the decline. So in the first strategy was managed to slow the decline, and we can see that actually in numbers. The next one, the second one that began in 2001, that's why everybody started talking about the American decline afterwards, is this strategy, the unilateral strategy that began in 2001. Now, the debate in some political circles is, can the original strategy be restored? And of course, it's almost very difficult to talk about restoring an old strategy because we are in a new world and a different historical moment. Okay, that's at the economic level. These are the predictions, not only scholars, not only journalists, but also what the American national intelligence say about the future. How would the world look in 2030? Basically, they say that the world in 2030 will be radically different. And the most important thing is that in 2030, there will be no hegemonic power. No country will be a hegemonic power, in the sense that no country will have the economic edge, political edge, military edge, to actually play the role of a hegemonic force in the world system. Under any scenario, under any potential scenario that they actually present for scenarios at the end. What we will see is a diffusion of power. And that diffusion, of course, is not clear. We don't know how this will actually take place. But I'm going to take you to the global power index. That's kind of a way to look at the power of each country. Basically, it's based on population size. And I would add, because this is part of what we call the new global power index, because it doesn't only look at the population size, but it looks at the population structure. And population structure, the consideration is, or the most significant aspect to consider is the graying of the industrial world, or the process of aging, basically. That an increasing number of, or proportion of certain countries is becoming old, so they are eligible for retirement and pension funds. But that will change what is called in demography dependency ratio. You need how many people work to actually fulfill the needs of society, or versus those who actually don't work, whether under 15 because they're children by some standards, or under 65 because they're old or retired. In the traditional index, China in 2030 will share the national power equal with the US. Europe would rank lower than the US. This is how it would look like. From 2010 to 2050, we will see a decline in the US power, a decline in the European power. China's power is ascending. Similarly, India. Japan is declining, but not much. Russia is very much staying where it is. The new power index, that adds other factors, health, education, and governance, would see very much the same, except really changes in the years. So China and India would share the global power, or their share of the global power would increase, but they will be a little bit less than the US. China's share would be 4 to 5 percentage points below the US. The EU would be closer to the US than the original one. Here is the index, but in all cases, it's actually declining for Europe, it's declining for the US, and it's increasing for China and increasing for the India and other countries. Now, combining both factors for the whole world, this is what we see. That basically using either index, the share of global power held by the EU, Japan, and Russia would be less, of course. Anyway, the power of the developing states will overtake that of the OECD countries, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. By 2030, it will actually exceed that. This is the traditional, this is the new, and the new would actually work in favor of the, again, would give the US more time, but basically by 2030, it will be gone. Well, not gone, but the non-OECD countries will exceed the OECD countries in terms of their power share. Okay, I added the aging factor. This is the world now, and I want you to look at the blue color because it's the post-mature one, over 45, and I have no idea what that color is. Europe will be basically old. Let me take you to the numbers. That will make our life. See, so the OECD countries, the median age for the OECD countries in 2030 would look like something around 43 years. So 43 would be the median age for the OECD countries. The Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. Basically the industrial countries. So we would see something like 52 in Japan, 49 in Germany, United Kingdom 42. The US would remain relatively young because of immigration. And they should thank the immigrants, actually, for this, because it's extending their power and their hegemony instead of doing what they do with them now. Okay, I don't want to go into the details of the report and spend more time because I want to get to the Israeli section. But these are the 4 scenarios for the American national intelligence, or the American national intelligence scenarios for the year 2030. The first one, they called it stalled engines. Basically, this is one of the worst case scenarios according to them. To me, I can imagine much worse. And I think they are also possible. But basically, it's a situation in which we have the interstate conflict would rise. And basically, because of the absence of a hegemonic power, it will be the state of chaos will kind of dominate. Each scenario would have an implication for the global economy, for conflict, for regional stability, for governance, for technology, science and technology, and the U.S. role in the world. In this case, the U.S. turns inward, ignoring the world. Of course, these are the implications for the rest of the world, or the important, supposedly, countries in the world. Fusion is supposedly the best scenario that could exist. And in that scenario, there is a cooperation between the United States and China to actually manage the world affairs. In this case, the per capita income would rise in the US, but basically, it's not going to be a hegemonic power again. The next one is the genie out of the bottle. I thought that was actually a worse scenario than the first one, but the national intelligence characterizes the first one as the worst case. And basically, we have it's a world of extremes, extreme poverty, extreme wealth, of all cases, also conflict. And the US basically will not be able or will not be willing to play the role of the police of the world. This is the last one, non-state world. Basically, world affairs will be kind of influenced and dictated by non-governmental organizations. What I want to say is this. Under any potential scenario projected by the national intelligence, the US is not a hegemonic power. So we don't have to argue now whether the world system theory, whether Samir Amin, or whether Emanuel Wallerstein, or whether the economic journalists are actually correct or right when they argue that there is a state of decline or not. This is the American national intelligence basically specifying 4 scenarios, 4 possible scenarios for the year 2030, which is tomorrow really, in 15 years, 17 years, and under any scenario, the US will not be a hegemonic power. It would remain strong, it would remain effective and powerful. We're not buying any illusion here that the US will become a third world country. It would be basically, I like actually the characterization of Stephen Walt, that it would be number 1 among equals. But the idea of hegemony here, that it's a hegemonic power, that it has an economic, political, military, and ideological edge, would not exist in the year 2030. That's really important for us because it... Are you trying to say something to me? Oh. Okay. My concern is really, again, one of the concerns that I have here is Israel. And how would Israel react to this situation? And the best way to look at it is to look at the Israeli reaction to the Arab uprisings. And in the first few months, actually, the Israeli political mind was actually standing naked before anybody who wanted to know how the Israeli mind works. Basically, their reaction told us who they are, how they think, and what's the nature of the American-Israeli relations. That is, you only need to read probably a couple of issues for the, from the Institute of National Security Studies, Israeli Institute of National Security Studies, to realize that the lobby doctrine or the lobby thesis is actually really is an illusion. Well, before we used to say people who don't agree with that, of course the lobbies exist. They have their own dynamics within the American society, and they have their own dynamics within the American political system. But the US is like any other country and like any other society is a class society. And there is a ruling class in the US that rules the country. It's not lobbies. Lobbies work within this system of class, or this class system. But that was a theoretical argument for people who were convinced that Israel rules the United States. They wouldn't be able, they would not change their mind based on this kind of argument because it's still theoretical, and the political elite perspective, for example, would not convince them. Excuse me. So I'm here not agreeing or disagreeing with the Israeli characterization of the Arab uprising. It's not my intention. It's not my intention to present my view of the Arab uprisings as much as to show what the Israelis said and what that means. And the context is basically this. These are, I'm going to get back. This is basically most of what I'm doing here is most of the survey that I'm presenting for their views is from the Herzliya Assessment 2011, which actually was taking place during the Egyptian Revolution. And actually Mubarak was hosted just actually during the conference. And they actually published the proceedings of the conference 3 months after the Osir of Mubarak. The survey would be actually 2011 and 2012, Herzliya 2011. Herzliya conference, which is for national security, one of the most significant gatherings or meetings in Israel. And of course, the publications of the Institute of National Security Studies, Israeli Institute of National Security Studies. They have basically 2 journals. They publish 2 journals, and they publish kind of weekly, sometimes daily insights, commentaries on the events and whether regional or world events. So this is where all this is coming from. But before I go there, after I collected them, and it's really interesting to read what the Israelis say, these are the 4 themes that run everywhere, basically, in the Israeli writings, whether in the Herzliya 2011 conference, 2012 conference, or the Institute of National Security Studies. The first one is the centrality of the American hegemony to the existence of the State of Israel. كيف تقولوا كيان غاصب بالإنجليزي؟ Anyway, the centrality of the American Middle East strategy, again, to Israel. Israel's regional status for the U.S. strategy, how valuable Israel is for the U.S. strategy in the region and in the world, and the regional balance of power. Again, America is also here. We don't see America, but it's also here. These are the 4 themes that run in almost every analysis that was published during this period. That's why I said that the Israeli political mind was out there for anybody who wanted to see how the Israeli political mind works, and to actually consider or reconsider the common conceptualization of the Israeli-American relations. This is part of the first reaction to the Arab uprisings. They were really scary to the Israelis. Of course, they changed their minds afterwards, or they became more quiet in their analysis. But this is they were talking about profound strategic uncertainty. When you use something like this in Herzliya assessment, in the Herzliya conference, you're talking about totally a new and scary world for them. They were imagining a different region and a different world. That's how significant the Arab uprising could have been. That's Herzliya 2011. These are some of the titles of the presentations in Herzliya 2011 that were actually, by the way, I think they actually changed the schedule at that time or changed some of the articles, but these are some of the titles. Reshuffling the deck of global influence and resources, shifting global balance of power, shifting sands in the Middle East, the diminishing posture of the US in the Middle East, facing the game changers. So we're talking about really significant and strategic expressions here. We're not talking about just commentaries on daily events or weekly events or even annual events. So they were realizing that Arab uprising have the potential to be actually, not only to transform the region, but also to transform the world. Until, of course, the counter-revolution began. Okay, this is back to how they read them. How they read them. As I said, the central idea was dictating the Israeli political thinking is the centrality of both US hegemony, global hegemony, and Israel's, the US presence in the US. In the third and last debate, third and last presidential debate, Oded Iran and Owen Alterman, probably two of the most important analysts, strategic analysts in Israel and the Institute, well, they're still there. They came with this concept. We all were witnessing, we are watching the debate, basically to see, probably for Americans, who would be a better president. People interested in American politics were interested in see where would the American where American direction would be. Or for the Israelis, this is why they were watching. The strategic analysts were watching the debate, and they came up with a conclusion that we are before a different America. Different America, not only Obama's America, even Mitt Romney's America would be different. And whoever watched the debate carefully should have noticed that Obama and Romney weren't really different at all. Even on the question of Iran, despite what Romney claimed earlier before the debate, he sounded more rational during the debate. In some sense, the conclusions the Israelis came up with, this is a different America. And a different America is a very scary idea for Israel. Because the American, and this is where I said you can sense existential threats. No country in the world, behave in this way. We think of regime change. Who cares about regimes? They can come and go, they change. But no other people in the world think in this existential way, that we could exist or cease to exist. Of course, except Israel, because they, at some level, they realize that they are a colonial venture. But this is what they see. Now, I think it's kind of accurate, the characterization. But when we say different America, we don't really mean that Israel is left on its own here. They say it's different from America, George Bush's and the Clinton's America. The United States will continue to give Israel strong diplomatic and financial support. Will even enhance military and intelligence cooperation, which Obama did more than anybody else. On the issue of war and peace, however, the vision may be for Israel to sort out its, on its own, with the United States standing with it. Basically, here you can sense the idea of Iran. And that's all the whole debate on Iran is the US should actually attack Iran or shouldn't attack Iran. But basically, here we are dealing with a different America. Why a different America is scary? Because the US is the most important aspect of Israel's national security. A decline in American hegemony, a retreat in the Middle East would mean that. Because the US-Israeli alliance is a building, that's from Herzliya. Let me see. What did it? I don't know what I did. Okay. I'm sorry. This is Moshe Ya'alon, who's the Minister of Strategic Affairs. That was in a speech he gave in Bar Ilan University. That's the university that has the controversy regarding building a university inside the West Bank. This is from Herzliya assessment. They say that the US-Israeli alliance is a building block of Israel's national security doctrine and deterrence image. Basically what they're saying is the Arabs fear us because of our relation with the US. An American decline would mean that the Arabs would change their minds about Israel. A strong US in the Middle East is a vital strategic interest of Israel. Again, confirming the same kind of thing. There is no strategic substitute to Israel's relation with the US. That's in Herzliya 2011 after actually exploring other potential strategies. They came up with the conclusion that there is no strategic substitute to Israel's relation with the US, and Israel's regional posture is intertwined with the position of the US in the Middle East. That's how significant an American decline to Israel is. At this point, two major trends pose considerable threat to Israel's national security. Read existence. The Iranian nuclear threat and the changing US strategic orientation and influence in the Middle East. It's kind of very serious. I can go. This is Herzliya 2012, not 2011. Of course, they became more quiet in their discourse later, and they made something really kind of rational, and that is they started taking every country separately and analyzing the conditions of every country separately. Egypt, Syria, Bahrain, Tunisia, Yemen, Bahrain. Did I say Bahrain? Yeah, because they always forget Bahrain for some reason. They also think that the US-Israeli strategic relations are now, given the Arab revolutions, are more important perhaps than ever before. This is more analysis of the Arab revolution, but again, the US is always there. I don't want to spend more time on this to give more time for our discussion. Did I take? This is one of the scary conclusions too. And that's Herzliya 2012, and which means after a year of the Arab uprisings and after a year of US reaction to the Arab uprisings, Herzliya assessment, which was titled Israel in the Eye of Storms, which also is very telling. It says basically that one cannot escape the impression that the US considers Israel a strategic risk at this point rather than a strategic asset. This wasn't the first time, actually. In October of 2010, General David Petraeus, who was forced out with a scandal a few months ago, basically said before the US Senate Armed Forces that the Arab-Israeli conflict is constituting a danger, is one of the factors that put the US forces in danger in the region, and actually is an obstacle for some of the US strategies in the region. And he was attacked actually by the lobby, by the Israeli lobby, and by others, by many other groups, basically for saying that. And from that time on, this idea that Israel is constituting a risk, Israel's political behavior, Israel's daily crimes constituting a threat to the US strategy in the region, to the US forces in the region, came out in the media, started being debated in the media. But the Herzliya assessment is based on more than that. It's not based on Petraeus' statement before the Armed Forces Senate Committee. It's based on a larger number of statements and studies. And basically, this is what they see. And actually, the controversy regarding Chuck Hagel's appointment for the Secretary of Defense recently, in the last 2 months, actually revealed much more than this. So they're facing two things. Not only the decline of the US hegemony in the world, withdrawal of the US from the Middle East, but also the changing perception of the US regarding Israel. And I want to say and end with one thing. I have more stuff to see if we have relevant questions to the material. But basically, in all the Israeli documents, an additional thing that comes out, first is the perception of the people of the Middle East or the Arab region, what they think of the American status in the region and the world, and the American perception of Israel. So the Israelis are not really, or at least the institute, the National Security Institute, is not really only interested in what's actually happening, but it's actually also interested in how the US perceives that, and how the Arabs perceive that. Because what people think is really important. And that actually signifies the genius of the idea that Israel is weaker than a spider's web. Because it actually reconstructs the image the Arabs hold about Israel, and reconstructs the image the Arabs hold about themselves, that we can defeat Israel. That's the idea behind the spider's web discourse. Not only we can defeat Israel, but Israel is actually defeatable, as the discourse demonstrated on, since 2000. So the idea of perception is very important, very central, and very significant, and the Israelis take it very serious. So no wonder they actually, in 2006, in July 2006, they came to Bint Jbeil, where Sayyid Nasrallah said, Israel is weaker than a spider's web, to plant the Israeli flag. They were responding to this perception, and were trying to tell the Arabs, your perception of us and yourself is wrong. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Before we start the period, I just want to remind everyone that we still have a full week of events happening. I think we passed out programs, but if you didn't get one on your way out. And actually, Dr. Seif has another presentation tomorrow at 6 p.m. in West Hall on colonial relations and the Palestinian movement. It's going to be great. So please come. I think just project your voice. I don't think we should pass around the mic. So, if you have questions, or introduce yourself.
We can't hear you.
I would never understand economy as it is being presented. Just simply as an activist, I would like to break down the things you were saying into my level of understanding. So one thing in the charts you were showing, where you were
سوق بالعربي
the US companies offshore, are they included in this? The US companies offshore. So you have a US company that is producing maybe outside the US, and then is this shown as a collection of the other countries like India or China or whatever, or is it considered in economy? I don't know. Or is it considered a production of the US? So we could understand that this were the target in activism. Was the decline that you were mentioning, this is my second question, was influenced in any way by the activism that was happening around the world. Second part, activism that was happening, anti-imperialism, anti-neoliberalism, whatsoever. Did it influence in this panoramic view, economic panoramic view that you show about the US thing? And second part of it, any countries who were trying to influence as well this imperialism and capitalism, China, were they actually doing strategically for the sake of us that we fight against this regime or capitalism? Cuba, I don't know, other countries, you tell me. 4 or 3, we can make the other ones together. Would be for the we understand that neoliberalism is a tool for capitalism to solve their problems, right? That was explained. Now, what is neoliberalism for a popular understanding for us activists? So, if we want to go and target neoliberalism on a local level, on a massive popular level, what is it? What is neoliberalism for us? What is that crossing point the graph means? 2030 is a crossing point between the decline and the descending and the ascending of yeah. That's a better way. Yes. Yeah, this was 2030 or something. Yeah, what does it mean to us?
This is when basically according to the global power index, of basically the industrial countries, the current industrial countries will be equal with the power of those countries we characterize now as the South.
Yeah, maybe just to brainstorm together, no need for an answer, but does it mean anything on the struggle level? Does it mean that there is this cross we have to target, because it will mean indicators on the level of I don't know, maybe there's a restructuring of something, so it's a gap that we could use for certain advance in our system.
This is a tool that is used basically to kind of the world in 2030.
So it means nothing to us.
No, it means to us that there will be, that's their conclusion, there will be no hegemonic power. The US will not be a hegemonic power. It will not have an edge. Yes, it's a process, of course. So if it could come in 2025, 2040, but that's where the trend is going.
So we have to figure out how we could be influencing that. The last question. Yes, the last question is actually a question on economics. Can we conclude after you this relation and Israel? You were saying that US is the most important aspect of the Israeli national security, not you, Israel.
They say that.
Yeah, so as a conclusion, can we say that the US is the last strategic ally for Israel? Can we put this as a conclusion and work on basis if we are actually doing any type of strategic planning for Israel? And then last is something like
that's what they say.
yes,
There is no strategic substitute to Israel's relation to the US.
yes, there's no. Does that mean earlier that the US is not going to be anymore hegemonic power?
Yeah.
So basically, we're saying that there is no power that is going to be supporting Israel. Is this a good conclusion?
Around 2030, 2040, it will be pro-Palestine.
That's good.
Unless we have a PA, of course. Then.
I think there is an important thing that we need for today. somehow I was reading something related to the strategic alliance between Israel. Back in 1980, I was reading it out of, I'm not going to say when and where, but anyways, so they were saying that one common goal between Israel and the U.S. is actually making sure that there is no Arab-Israeli confrontation, because this will make the Americans back then confront the USSR. So they were trying to prevent anything similar. They were trying to like seize it or put it in freeze. So today we are facing clashes, conflict, like things are changing around the Arab countries.
Can I just take that fast? Yes. Well, during the Cold War, basically there was, and I guess this is part of the implications of what is called the Yalta Agreement between the US and the Soviet Union. And basically it's to isolate any conflict and not transform this conflict into a regional one. Yes. So for 8 years, the Iraqis and the Iranians were fighting, and that did not spill over to the rest of the region or to other. But after 1991, all conflicts became entwined, and therefore any conflict would, by implication and necessity, would spill over to the rest of the region and probably even beyond the region. So now, do we need evidence that Israel is not interested or is trying to contain itself from attacking other countries or other people? Well, we have only one example in which Israel was reluctant to attack, and that's the case of Lebanon after 2006, because of the ability of Lebanon to deter, or the Lebanese resistance to deter Israel from attacking Lebanon. Other than that, nothing prevented Israel from...
The Lebanese Islamic Resistance have been in the discourse of Hassan Nasrallah after 2006. They made it clear that the second war against Israel is an open war, which means it's going to be a regional war against Israel. And when it is like this, with the instability that exists in the region, and the decline of, or the independence of Israel to choose its wars, is there a possibility of a regional war against Israel, whereby we would see confrontations against Israel, not only from the Lebanese front, but considerable fronts?
Let me take what I sit with you, Rabia. I can sit with you and we can talk about this, all this. But I will take what I remember by now from your questions. The first one, what I used actually, and this is not what I use, it's what the World Bank uses, what the World System Theory uses, and they use basically the GDP, and they define it as the following. It's a gross domestic product converted to international dollars using the purchasing power parity. And what's included in it is the sum of gross value added by all residents, producers in the economy, plus any product taxes and minus any subsidies not included in the value of the products. It's calculated without making deductions for depreciation or of fabricated assets or for depletion and degradation of natural resources. Data are in current national dollars. So you can add parts of this. Basically, if these companies pay taxes, these taxes go there. If these companies, and usually they do, if they don't, then it doesn't. But basically, it's one of the best measures that we have for the state of the economy. So, and it's not going to make a big difference really. And when we talk about companies like you mean multinational companies, they're not really American in that sense. They are multinational. So even if you exclude them or exclude part of them, you're not excluding much. I know that some of the companies are some of the largest economies in the world. That's true. But in this case, we're looking at one country, one political entity, and that's the best indicator to read its economic status globally, basically. As for the last, I think we answered this. And as for the last one, what I meant basically is when you talk about the Arab-Israeli conflict, we talk basically about a comprehensive kind of conflict. It's not really only militarily conflict. It's on all fronts: political, economic, ideological, and all fronts, and cultural, etc. So one aspect of the conflict that Israel actually was doing very well in until probably the year 2000 is the ideological one, and their ability to spread which is really an ideological view that Israel is undefeatable. I mean, the Roman Empire, not the Roman Empire. We're talking about the U.S., the greatest empire in history, the most powerful empire in history. And we're talking about the decline of the U.S. And I'm really shocked that they were able to sell the idea that Israel, not the U.S., Israel is undefeatable. But that ideological view actually was successful. Even when you read the biography or the memoir of Abu Iyad, you see that statement, I think, somewhere between page 90 and 110. I showed it last time when I was in Beirut. He says Israel is undefeatable. Even one of the leaders of the Palestinian revolution accepted this ideological view. Now, the value of the victory in 2000 is that it was able not only to tell us there is a new Arab and a new Israeli. The Israeli is defeatable or can be defeated. The Arab can win and can defeat the Israeli. And that's the idea of the spider, being weaker than a spider's web. But actually, they proved it on the ground. Israel was actually defeated before Sayyid Nasrallah said it's weaker than a spider's web. The resistance defeated Israel and forced Israel to leave Lebanon. Now, we've seen similar thing in the case of the war on Gaza, the last wave of the confrontation in Gaza. When Tel Aviv was hit, and people who are familiar with again, the same thing. The war ended in almost 7 days or 8 days. But basically, that's part of the tools of the war. The ideological, the conceptions, your conception of yourself, and the image you hold for yourself and for the enemy. You can be easily defeated if you assume that your enemy is undefeatable. You cannot fight a war with this assumption. So that was the significance of the victory, the cultural, if you like, significance, and the ideological significance of the military success. And I think this is part of what I will do tomorrow when we talk about the economic front in Palestine and the PA. That Israel actually dominated even the Palestinian areas, not militarily really primarily, but through an economic and political strategy that was able to restructure the class, or to restructure the class system in Palestine and control or dictate the economic structure of the Palestinian areas. And then the translation, people were talking about the Paris Agreement or the economic agreement in Paris in 1994, which is part of Oslo too. But actually it began in 1967, even much earlier than this. So they were dominating through the economy. They were dominating through the ideology. I'll give you one more example, and that's in Nigeria, basically. And what colonization and what imperialism does, basically, is they would prepare a track, and then if the colonized people walk in this track, they will be colonized without the use of force. In Nigeria, basically, they divided Nigeria, the English colonization, divided Nigeria into north and south based on assumptions of how light the complexion is. The lighter the complexion, they said, the more civilized. And based on their religion, Islam in Nigeria was perceived to be closer to Christianity, so they were more civilized than the Africans in the south. And they gave each section of Nigeria a different administrative system. And they left, they left 60 years ago. For the last 60 years, Nigeria has been going through civil wars, military coup d'etat, and instability. And all what the English did, basically, is provided them with this ideology. We saw that in Egypt, but Nasser's revolution was able to come this. For almost 100 years, or even 60 or 70 years, the English colonization was convincing the Egyptians that they constitute a nation by themselves. That's why in 1948, the Egyptian reaction to the Palestinian suffering and to the Nakba wasn't more than a neighbor going through a tragedy, or a brother in religion, Muslim or Christian, going through tough times, but not part of the same nation. That's when Nasser came and changed this whole thing. So the national ideology in Egypt was one of these obstacles for not only misperceiving the question of Palestine as a colonial issue, but actually even misperceiving the chances of Egypt to be free and to be liberated from the English colonization. I'm not sure if I forgot most of the other stuff, but yes. Of course. When we say that, when we say this statement, Israel is not going to collapse by itself. If nobody fights Israel, I can make a case, and actually this is my area, I can make an ecological case that Israel is ecologically unsustainable. But ecology alone is not going to defeat Israel. To defeat Israel, you need people. The Arabs have to defeat Israel. And so this alone is not enough, but that's part of the new reality in which the Arab resistance will find itself in. So it's going to be, it's not a sufficient factor, basically, but it's good to have, and it's changing the landscape of the confrontation. For the American hegemony, yes. Three things actually contributed to the American decline, specifically the political decline. The 1968 revolutions, one of the themes that ran throughout the 1968 was, we don't like the American hegemony. Also, they said we don't like the Soviet hegemony, too. But targeting the American hegemony was one of the themes in the 1968 revolutions all over the world, but primarily in Europe and the rest of the world. The Algerian liberation victory of the Algerian liberation, the victory of the Cubans in the early 60s, also led to a very significant thing, which is restructuring the geopolitics of the world. You know, any event, usually, at least we know that for sure after 1991, any local event now is by implication and necessity a regional and sometimes global event. That's what happened in Tunisia. Did not stay in Tunisia, like they say in Vegas, right? But even if we don't see the immediate implications, it still contributes to structuring or restructuring the geopolitics of the world. And these three events, the victory of the Algerian Liberation Front, the Cuban victory in the early 60s, and also the Chinese Revolution was one of the most significant. That's why actually Noam Chomsky says the American decline did not begin in 1967, as Wallerstein says. He says it began in 1949, when they lost China. But in the 60s, China was siding neither with the US nor with the Soviet Union. And that actually part of the same theme that was running in the 1968 revolution. And of course, the non-aligned movement of Nasser and Tito and Nehru, that they were constituting another bloc, the historical bloc in Antonio Gramsci's terminology, that Nasser managed to actually build this historical bloc because he understood that Egypt alone cannot face mega empires, great empires, and we need the rest of the countries of the world who suffer from the same imperial forces to come together and fight together. So of course, when we do this, we tend to be, we tend to sound structuralist in some sense, but of course the human agency has to be always there, and I totally believe in the creative and active role of human agency. At the end, despite the fact that I'm a sociologist and we believe that man is dead, and we believe it's only structures that work, I believe man is alive, and so I'm betraying my profession. Anybody else?
South African apartheid and what happened, what's happening in Israel and Palestine.
attract that much attention and create that much power to eventually break the system?
I think the US, and I see their activism all the time, and I think it's also in Europe. But I think that the battleground is in Palestine. Yes, it's. No. The BDS is. I'm not underestimating any kind of struggle. What I'm saying is, yes, during the fight against the apartheid regime in South Africa, people in the U.S. were actually struggling against it and actually challenging even President Reagan at that time to stop supporting the apartheid regime in South Africa. In Europe, all over the world, that was true. But really, the battle against the apartheid regime in South Africa was settled in South Africa. And I don't want to undermine the importance of the South African, the support for the anti-apartheid struggle in the rest of the world. But really, the people in South Africa have been struggling against the system for decades. And by the time it crumbled, it was the collective effort. But I think the central effort was in South Africa. The main thing was in South Africa, that the system became not only unsustainable, but it couldn't work anymore. And in the case of Palestine, yes, these forms of struggle are, I can't estimate how important they are. They are very important. Every form of support for the Palestinian struggle is important. But at the end of the day, it's an Arab-Israeli struggle, and at the end of the day, the Arabs have to settle. The battleground would be in Palestine, and the Palestinians and the Arabs would bear the greatest share of the struggle against Israel. But the rest.
Exactly what you're saying here, because you're saying if it wasn't for the U.S. support, then Israel wouldn't be able to sustain itself. So if it's just up to the Arabs and Israel, we've been fighting them for 60 years. So if it wasn't for the U.S. support,
Yes.
it wouldn't be still around. So it's actually, how can we affect the U.S. support for Israel? I think is what would make the difference.
I am not disagreeing with you that this is an important battle that the supporters of the Palestinian cause should fight, and the Palestinians are fighting, and the supporters of the Palestinian cause are fighting. But even in the absence, let's go back to the death of man again. In the absence of these structural processes, we still need the human agency. That we need the people, the Palestinians to fight. I'll give you an example. Rashid al-Ghannouchi, the head of Al-Nahda party in Tunisia, came to the U.S. and he spoke before the Institute for Middle East Studies. And he basically told them, I'm not going to be more Palestinian than the Palestinians. If they recognize Israel, then I will recognize Israel. So at the end, the Palestinians will have to play the central role in fighting Israel. Now, should the American support for Israel decline, and it will, at least this is what what the Israelis are saying. Would Israel collapse by itself? Would Israel collapse because is it sustainable without a U.S. support? Well, at the beginning, it wouldn't have been sustainable, until probably 1967. Now it is, but that's why the fight is really against Israel is really important. My concern with this kind of emphasis on BDS, again, I'm not underestimating it, but my concern is because I don't want to dismiss any other form of resistance, and I don't want to dismiss the central role that the Palestinians themselves have to play. Because some Palestinian officials come to the U.S., some Palestinian officials go to Europe, and they are actually met by protests by the same groups that are supporting the Palestinians. Some of the Palestinian officials are actually asking other world countries to actually restrict the activism of some of these groups. In South Africa, they did it in Brazil, just in the World Social Forum a few months ago. They even prevented Palestinian activists from going to Brazil. So it's a Palestinian-Israeli, Arab-Israeli, and international conflict. And all dimensions of the conflict are really important, but I think the most significant is the Arab-Israeli one. I'm not sure if I was clear.
Is there anyone else who has a question as well?
I wanted to understand, in your opinion, who is the bigger boogeyman? The United States or the neoliberal? Because all the charts that you were showing and how the American economy was decreasing in relation to the world economy. So neoliberalism, of course, is on a massive increase. China and India are becoming much more capitalistic and neoliberal. And we are becoming everything that's happening around us. Its impact on the environment and the world, and its relationship on us to land and to our natural resources. It's changing us. We're becoming what we were supposed to be fighting in many ways. So how do you relate this? Because everything you're showing is about the decline of the US and how some of us get excited about, wow, but something else is happening. And how do you relate it to, there is this idea that at least Americans talk about a lot, that one of the reasons why America is so powerful is that it has an amazing capacity to always reinvent itself in moments of crisis and change. If you look at the civil rights movement, it did not.
Yeah. And the rest of the world cannot? They come from a different planet?
What I'm saying is that when you're presenting this this kind of analysis of the Americans, of how they see themselves in the world and how they're changing their global strategy, and they know that they're becoming much, much more smaller, but for sure there is a strategy in order to use it. Just to continue my idea, they have a strategy in order to taking advantage of this. I assume all these thinkers and people who are doing this, especially if we relate it to, I don't know, Naomi Klein and disaster capitalism, and the idea that you don't need stability to create growth and to be rich. In fact, war and all these small conflicts are part of the neoliberal hegemony that is happening around the world.
Okay.
It's allowing capitalism to make more money and continue to grow and grow despite everything.
Okay, let me say that again. What I talked about two frameworks from which we can perceive this issue. The first one is the 1945 to the present, which was the one I focused on because I'm interested in the American decline. But I said the larger context is the crisis of capitalism, and part of this where neoliberalism is going. But in both frameworks, we end up we move from a unipolar world, and actually the world system theory even argues that the US has been the sole superpower since 1945. This whole idea of a Soviet Union and a bipolar world is not really true. The US was a unipolar since 1945. Now we're going into a multipolar world. And in a multipolar world, we have a different global political structure in which neoliberalism would not function in the same way. You have new markets, regional markets are rising. All the scenarios indicate, under any scenario of the four scenarios projected by the American National Intelligence, the neoliberalism as we know it would not be functional in the same way at least we know it today. Now, true. I said it's the most powerful tool. That's why we see it now. It's everywhere, and it's the most successful strategy. But does that mean that it hasn't been challenged? It has been challenged, and it is being challenged. And we have been seeing these regional markets, at least the experience of, I'll give you an example, Latin America, for example. Also, China. China has its own regulations. And supposedly, the neoliberalism would be against any kind of state regulations. Well, that's true if the country is weak. If we're talking about Bangladesh, then the US would be able to force its conditions on Bangladesh, but not on China. We've witnessed a few years ago the tension between the US even and Europe regarding the steel issue, because the US was imposing too much taxes on European steel and basically no taxes on the US steel, making the US steel much more competitive in the global market than the European steel. Europe, of course, responded with I think with imposing taxes on meat, on American meat, and imposing taxes on extra taxes or more taxes on other American products. when we talk about these kinds of markets and these kinds of states that have enough power to challenge what they think of or what they see as unfair treatment, they will do it. In China, they do it. In Latin America, they do it. And in Europe, they will do it. But we live in countries, especially in the Arab world, not only that we don't have the ability or the power to resist this mistreatment by neoliberalism and the unfair conditions and terms, in some sense, our governments don't even want to do that. They're not even willing to even practice or exercise that. As long as we have these things, then yes, neoliberalism will function properly, or at least in the ideal sense that it's an open market. But is it an open market? I mean, the whole debate on the Chinese currency recently has been an issue in the news, has a lot to do with America trying to deal with Chinese regulations imposed on what they see as free market or market economy or neoliberalism. So it's not as ideal as they present to us. It's an open free market. It's not. As a matter of fact, if you say, usually they would look at this idea by looking at the state expenditure per capita. And that's what the US and the World Bank and the IMF demands from different countries in the world, that they should reduce their expenditure on education, on health, and transform everything into the private sector. But if you look at the same countries, the US and Europe, that are promoting neoliberal agenda, the state expenditure per capita is actually increasing. So they're preaching something to the world, and they're doing something else. So neoliberalism is not as ideal as the thesis go. And I think it has been functioning well in some countries in the South, but it has been challenged, and it will be challenged. And if the world changes, and it is changing, then if the world system theory argument is true, we're not even going through a decline of an American hegemony. We're going through a terminal crisis of the world capitalist system. Okay, thank you.